The ancient walls of Sandringham House had witnessed countless royal Christmas gatherings, but never one quite like this. As snow began to fall across the Norfolk estate on Christmas Eve 2024, King Charles III stood in his private study, holding a letter that would either heal a family wound or deepen it forever. The letter bore the unmistakable handwriting of his younger son, Prince Harry, the first direct communication between them in over 18 months. Outside, the familiar sounds of Christmas preparation echoed through the corridors. Staff members bustled about, setting up the traditional Christmas tree in the Grand Hall, the same spot where generations of royals had gathered. But this year felt different. This year, the king faced the most personal decision of his reign, whether to publicly address the absence that had cast a shadow over every royal gathering since 2020. The British public had watched the royal family fracture in real time, played out across newspaper headlines and television interviews. They had seen a father lose his son, a brother drift away from his family, and ancient traditions strain to their breaking point. What they hadn't seen was the private anguish of a king torn between his duty to the crown and his love for his child. As Charles set the letter down and walked to the window overlooking the estate where Harry had once run as a carefree child, he knew that his next words would echo around the world. The question that weighed on his mind was simple yet profound. Can a king speak as a father, or must duty always silence the heart? This Christmas at Sandringham would mark more than just another holiday. It would become the moment when King Charles chose to break his silence about Prince Harry, setting in motion events that would either bring the royal family together or tear them further apart. The world was about to discover that even kings must sometimes choose between their crown and their children. The morning of December 20th, 2024, began like any other at Buckingham Palace, but King Charles III could feel the weight of unspoken words pressing down on him like a physical burden. He had been king for over 2 years now, yet the hardest decisions he faced had nothing to do with matters of state, and everything to do with matters of the heart. As he reviewed his schedule for the upcoming Christmas celebrations at Sandringham, one glaring absence dominated his thoughts. His younger son, Prince Harry, would not be joining the family for the 5th consecutive year. The king's private secretary had tactfully arranged the Christmas guest list, but Charles knew that every member of the British press and millions of royal watchers worldwide would notice who wasn't there. The empty chair at the Christmas dinner table had become a symbol of the deep rift that had torn through the House of Windsor, a wound that seemed to deepen with each passing holiday season. Charles walked through the corridors of Buckingham Palace, past portraits of his ancestors who had faced their own family crises. He paused before a painting of King George VI, his grandfather, who had navigated the abdication crisis when his brother chose love over duty. The parallels weren't lost on Charles, though in his case, it was his son who had chosen a different path, stepping away from royal duties to build a new life across the Atlantic. The silence between father and son had stretched on for months, broken only by formal communications through intermediaries. Charles had watched from afar as Harry built his new life in California with Meghan and their children, Archie and Lilibet. The king had missed precious moments with his grandchildren, birthdays, and milestones that should have brought joy but instead brought only heartache. Every photograph that surfaced in the American media was a reminder of the growing distance between them. The decision to speak publicly about Harry had not come lightly. For years, the royal family had adhered to their unofficial motto of never complain, never explain, maintaining dignified silence even as headlines screamed accusations and counter-accusations. But Charles was discovering that being a king meant making choices his mother had never faced in quite the same way. The world had changed, and perhaps the monarchy needed to change with it. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. His private secretary entered with the day's correspondence, including several letters from members of the public asking about Prince Harry's absence from royal events. These letters had become increasingly common, with people expressing genuine concern about the family rift and urging reconciliation. Charles read each one carefully, moved by the genuine care these strangers showed for his family's well-being. One letter particularly caught his attention, written by an elderly woman from Yorkshire who had lost her own son to a family disagreement years ago. She wrote about the regret that consumed her daily, how pride had kept her from reaching out until it was too late. "Your Majesty," she wrote, "don't let pride rob you of precious time with your son. A father's love should know no boundaries, not even those of duty and protocol." The words hit Charles like a physical blow. He had always prided himself on putting duty before personal feelings, just as his mother had taught him. But was there not also a duty to be a father, to bridge gaps and heal wounds? The woman's letter made him question whether his silence was truly dignified restraint or simply fear disguised as protocol. That afternoon, Charles met with his closest advisors to discuss the upcoming Christmas broadcast, an annual tradition where the monarch addresses the Commonwealth. The broadcast team had prepared the usual themes: service, community, faith, and resilience. But Charles found himself pushing back against the sanitized script that made no acknowledgement of the very real struggles his own family was facing. "How can I speak about unity and healing?" he asked his communications team, "when I cannot even heal the divisions in my own family? How can I call for understanding when I have allowed misunderstanding to fester for years?" His senior advisor, a man who had served the royal family for decades, shifted uncomfortably. "Your Majesty, the Christmas message has traditionally focused on broader themes rather than personal matters." "But perhaps that's exactly the problem," Charles replied, his voice gaining strength. "Perhaps the people need to see that we are human too, that we face the same struggles they do. Maybe it's time to speak honestly about what it means to be a family, even a royal one." The room fell silent. Charles could see the concern in his advisor's eyes. They had spent their careers managing royal communications, carefully crafting messages that revealed nothing while saying everything expected of them. But Charles was proposing something revolutionary: genuine transparency about royal family struggles. As evening fell, Charles retreated to his private apartments and pulled out a leather-bound journal he had kept since his youth. He turned to recent entries, reading his own words about missing Harry, about wondering if his grandchildren would remember him, about the sleepless nights spent questioning every decision he had made as a father. The journal revealed a man torn between two worlds: the public face of monarchy and the private ache of a father's love. He thought about Harry as a child, full of energy and mischief, the boy who had brought laughter to the often serious world of royal protocol. He remembered Harry's devastation after Diana's death, how the young prince had struggled to find his place in a world that seemed to offer him only duty and constraint. Charles had watched his son grow into a passionate young man, dedicated to causes like mental health and veteran support, only to see that passion turn to frustration with the limitations of royal life. The king walked to his desk and began to write, not a formal statement or carefully crafted speech, but simply the words of a father who missed his son. He wrote about pride and stubbornness, about love that transcended disagreement, about the particular pain of watching a child walk away and not knowing how to call them back. The words flowed freely, years of suppressed emotion finally finding expression. Outside his window, London continued its busy pace, unaware that their king was wrestling with the most personal decision of his reign. Christmas was just days away, and Charles knew that whatever he decided to say or not say about Harry would echo far beyond the walls of Sandringham. The world was watching, waiting to see if the royal family's famous stiff upper lip would finally crack to reveal the human hearts beating beneath. As he sealed his handwritten letter, not to be sent, but simply to clarify his own thoughts, Charles realized that his decision was already made. The question was no longer whether to speak about Harry, but how to do so with the honesty his people deserved while still maintaining the dignity his position demanded. The king was about to discover that sometimes the most royal thing a monarch can do is admit to being wonderfully, painfully human. The stage was set for a Christmas unlike any other at Sandringham, where ancient traditions would meet modern realities, and a king would choose between the safety of silence and the risk of speaking from his heart. What Charles didn't yet know was that his decision would set in motion a chain of events that would change not just his relationship with Harry, but the entire future of the British monarchy. The weight of silence was about to be replaced by the courage of truth, and nothing would ever be the same again. The journey to Sandringham always stirred deep emotions in King Charles III, but this year the familiar route, through Norfolk countryside felt different. As his car wound through the estate gates on December 22nd, memories flooded back of countless Christmases past, when Harry had been an integral part of every tradition, every laugh, every moment that made the royal family feel like a real family despite the weight of their public roles. Charles gazed out at the estate where he had spent so many formative years, where his own relationship with his parents had been tested and strengthened, where Harry had learned to walk, to ride, to be a prince, and simply to be a boy. The ancient oak trees stood bare against the winter sky, their branches reaching upward like arms seeking something just out of reach. How fitting, Charles thought, considering his own desperate desire to reconnect with his absent son. Sandringham House came into view, its red brick facade warm and welcoming despite the cold December air. Staff members were already bustling about, preparing for the annual gathering of the Windsor family. But Charles could feel the absence of Harry's energy, the particular warmth and humor his younger son had always brought to these occasions. The house seemed somehow smaller without Harry's booming laugh echoing through its halls. As Charles entered his childhood home, he was greeted by the familiar scents of pine from the massive Christmas tree and the subtle aroma of traditional Christmas preparations wafting from the kitchen. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, was already there with William and their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis. The children ran to greet their grandfather with the uninhibited joy that only the very young possess, temporarily lifting the weight from his heart. But even in these precious moments with his grandchildren, Charles couldn't help but think of the other grandchildren he was missing, Archie and Lilibet, Harry's children who barely knew their grandfather. He had seen them only in carefully orchestrated visits, and through photographs shared by mutual friends. The thought that they might grow up without really knowing him was perhaps the most painful aspect of this entire family rift. Catherine approached him with her characteristic warmth and tact. "Papa," she said softly, using the family nickname. "The children have been asking about Uncle Harry again. They remember him from when they were smaller." Charles nodded, understanding the delicate position Catherine occupied as a bridge between the brothers who had once been inseparable. She had watched William and Harry's relationship deteriorate from the inside, had tried her best to mediate and heal wounds that seemed to deepen with each misunderstanding. Her own pain at the family division was evident, though she bore it with the grace that had made her beloved by the British public. "What do you tell them?" Charles asked, genuinely curious about how they explained Harry's absence to children who remembered him as the fun uncle who played soccer in the palace corridors and told the best bedtime stories. "We tell them that families sometimes disagree, but that love remains," Catherine replied carefully. "We tell them that Uncle Harry is building his own family now, and that we hope they'll meet their cousins someday." That evening, as the extended royal family gathered for their traditional Christmas Eve dinner, the empty chairs seemed to multiply. Not just Harry's absence, but Meghan's too, and by extension, Archie and Lilibet. The seating arrangement had been carefully planned to minimize the visual impact of their absence, but Charles felt it keenly nonetheless. William approached his father as they stood in the drawing room before dinner. The heir to the throne looked older than his years, bearing the weight of his own complicated feelings about his brother's departure. "Father," he said quietly, "I know this is difficult, but perhaps it's time we address this publicly. The speculation in the media is becoming overwhelming." Charles studied his elder son's face, seeing his own struggle reflected there. William had perhaps suffered the most from Harry's departure, losing not just a brother but his closest friend and ally. The two princes had once been united by their shared loss of Diana, but that same tragedy had ultimately driven them apart as they chose different ways to honor their mother's memory and deal with the pressures of royal life. "I've been thinking the same thing," Charles admitted, "but I want to be sure that whatever I say comes from the right place. This isn't about managing public opinion. It's about healing our family." After dinner, Charles walked alone through the estate grounds, following paths he had walked countless times with both his sons. He remembered teaching Harry to ride his bicycle right here on these same paths, holding onto the seat and running alongside until Harry found his balance and pedaled away confidently, turning back with a grin that could light up the darkest winter day. He paused at the memorial garden Diana had loved, where she had often brought the boys to play and explore. The garden was dormant now in the winter cold, but Charles could almost hear the echoes of young voices, William and Harry's laughter mixing with their mother's as she encouraged their adventures. Diana had always been the one to break protocol, to prioritize emotional connection over royal tradition. Perhaps, Charles thought, it was time to honor her memory by following her example. The next morning, Christmas Eve, brought the traditional Christmas tree decorating ceremony. It was a private family tradition, but one that media photographers were sometimes allowed to capture. This year, Charles made a spontaneous decision that surprised his staff and family alike. As young Louis hung a particularly crooked ornament on the tree, Charles smiled and said loudly enough for the photographers to hear, "Harry always hung his ornaments crooked too. I miss that about Christmas." The comment was spontaneous, unscripted, and completely contrary to royal protocol. His private secretary looked alarmed, but Charles felt a sense of relief at finally acknowledging his son's absence aloud. The photographers captured the moment, and within hours, the king's wistful comment was making headlines around the world. That afternoon brought another tradition, the annual Christmas Eve walk to St. Mary Magdalene Church. As the royal family emerged from Sandringham House, hundreds of well-wishers lined the route, many carrying signs and banners. Charles noticed immediately that many of the signs bore messages about Harry. Bring Harry home. Forgive and forget. Royal families need love too. The public's obvious affection for Harry and their desire to see the family reunited touched Charles deeply. These people understood that beneath the crowns and titles, the Windsors were a family dealing with the same struggles that countless other families faced. The difference was that their struggle was playing out on the world stage, every gesture analyzed and every absence noted. During the Christmas Eve service, Charles found himself thinking about the sermon's message of reconciliation and forgiveness. The rector spoke about the courage required to make the first move toward healing, about swallowing pride for the sake of love. The words seemed directed specifically at him, though he knew the rector had no way of knowing about his internal struggle. As they walked back from church, Princess and Charles's sister fell into step beside him. Known for her direct manner and practical approach to royal duties, and had always been someone Charles could count on for honest advice. "You know, Charles," she said in her typically straightforward way, "Mother would have found a way to fix this by now. She had a gift for knowing when to bend the rules for the sake of the family." Charles nodded, thinking of his mother's wisdom and her ability to adapt the monarchy to changing times while preserving its essential dignity. Queen Elizabeth II had navigated countless family crises with grace and pragmatism, always putting the institution first, but never forgetting that the institution was ultimately about people. That evening, as Charles prepared for bed, he received an unexpected visitor. William knocked on his door, carrying a small wrapped package. "I found this among Harry's things that he left behind," William explained. "I thought you might want to see it." Charles unwrapped the package to find a photograph of the three of them, Charles, William, and Harry, taken during a private moment at Diana's funeral. In the photo, they stood together, supporting each other through unimaginable grief. Charles had never seen this particular image before, and it took his breath away. Here was proof of their bond, their love for each other even in the darkest moments. "He kept this?" Charles asked, his voice thick with emotion. William nodded. "I think he wanted to remember that we were once there for each other. Maybe we can be again." That night, Charles lay awake thinking about the photograph, about the young man who had carefully preserved a memory of family unity even as he prepared to step away from royal life. Perhaps Harry's departure hadn't been about rejection, but about finding his own way to honor his mother's memory and serve others. Perhaps there was more common ground than any of them had realized. As Christmas Day dawned, Charles made his final decision about what he would say in his Christmas broadcast. The speech would acknowledge Harry's absence directly, but more than that, it would extend an invitation, not just to his son, but to any family struggling with division during the holiday season. The king was about to speak not just as a monarch, but as a father who missed his child, setting the stage for what would become one of the most memorable and controversial Christmas messages in royal history. Christmas morning at Sandringham dawned crisp and clear, with frost painting delicate patterns on the windows of the Norfolk estate. King Charles III stood in his dressing gown, looking out at the grounds where his family had gathered for generations to celebrate the most important holiday of the year. But this Christmas morning carried in weight unlike any other. In just a few hours, he would deliver what his advisors were already calling the most personal Christmas message in royal history. The traditional Christmas Day schedule at Sandringham followed patterns established over decades. Morning service at St. Mary Magdalene Church, followed by Christmas dinner, and then the afternoon recording of the King's Christmas broadcast. But Charles had already upended tradition by insisting that this year's message would be recorded live, with no opportunity for editing or second thoughts. His communications team had protested vigorously, but Charles was determined that his words would be unfiltered and genuine. As the royal family prepared for the morning church service, Charles could feel the tension in the air. Word had somehow leaked that this year's Christmas message would be different, and media speculation was running wild. Some newspapers had already printed headlines speculating about whether the king would address the Harry situation directly. The pressure was enormous, but Charles felt a strange sense of calm about his decision. The walk to St. Mary Magdalene Church was lined with even more well-wishers than usual, many holding signs specifically about Harry and Meghan. Charles was moved to see messages of support not just for him, but for the entire family. "Reconciliation is royal," read one banner. "Every family needs healing," proclaimed another. The public's investment in the royal family's personal struggles was both touching and sobering. During the Christmas service, Charles found himself studying the faces of his family members. William sat with Catherine and their children, maintaining his composure but clearly feeling the weight of the day. The children seemed to sense the unusual tension, staying closer to their parents than usual. Princess Anne sat with her characteristic straightforward dignity, while other family members showed varying degrees of awareness that this Christmas would be remembered as a turning point. The sermon that morning, delivered by the rector of Sandringham, focused on the theme of homecoming and reconciliation. Charles wondered if the rector had somehow been informed about the content of his planned broadcast. But the elderly clergyman's words seemed genuinely inspired rather than coordinated. He spoke about the courage required to acknowledge mistakes, the strength needed to extend forgiveness, and the wisdom of putting love before pride. As they walked back to Sandringham House after the service, Charles noticed his security detail was unusually alert. The global attention focused on this particular Christmas had increased security concerns, but Charles was determined not to let external pressures influence what he needed to say as a father. Christmas dinner was both wonderful and bittersweet. The children's excitement and joy filled the grand dining room, but the empty places at the table seemed to echo with absence. Charles watched his grandchildren and thought about Archie and Lilibet, who were probably opening presents thousands of miles away in California. What traditions were they creating in their new home? Did they think about their grandfather on Christmas Day? After dinner, Charles retreated to prepare for the broadcast. His speech had been written and rewritten dozens of times, but ultimately he had decided to speak largely from his heart rather than from prepared remarks. He wanted his words to feel genuine, to carry the emotional weight that this moment demanded. The broadcast was set up in the white drawing room at Sandringham, the same room where Queen Elizabeth II had recorded many of her Christmas messages. The familiar surroundings provided comfort, but also served as a reminder of the weight of tradition he was about to break. The television crew worked quietly and efficiently, understanding the gravity of the moment. As Charles sat in the ornate chair where his mother had delivered so many carefully crafted Christmas messages, he thought about the millions of people who would hear his words. Families around the Commonwealth would gather around their televisions, expecting the usual themes of service, duty, and national unity. Instead, they were about to hear something unprecedented, a monarch speaking openly about family pain and personal struggle. The red light on the camera indicated they were live, broadcasting to millions of homes across the Commonwealth and around the world. Charles looked directly into the camera lens and began to speak, his voice steady but carrying unmistakable emotion. "My dear friends across the Commonwealth and around the world," he began, following the traditional opening. This Christmas finds us gathered once again in celebration of hope, renewal, and the enduring power of love. But I speak to you today not just as your king, but as a father and grandfather who understands that the greatest challenges we face are often the most personal ones. The words hung in the air, already signaling that this message would be different from any that had come before. Charles could see his communications director shift nervously behind the cameras, but he pressed on. As families gather today across our nations and beyond, some tables have empty chairs. Some voices are missing from the conversations. Some hugs remain ungiven. This is the reality of modern life, where families are sometimes separated by distance, by disagreement, or by the simple complexity of finding our own paths in this world. Charles paused, gathering his courage for what came next. In my own family, we too have experienced the pain of separation. My son Harry, his wife Megan, and my beloved grandchildren Archie and Lilibet are not with us today. Their absence is felt keenly, not just by me, but by all of us who love them. The admission sent shockwaves through living rooms across the Commonwealth. Never before had a British monarch spoken so directly about family discord. Charles could almost feel the collective intake of breath from millions of viewers. I want to be clear, Charles continued, his voice growing stronger, that love does not end when disagreement begins. A father's love for his son transcends any difference of opinion about duty or destiny. Today, I want to say publicly what I have struggled to say privately, that I miss my son. I am proud of the man he has become, and our door will always remain open to him and his family. The king paused again, visibly emotional but determined to continue. Harry chose a different path, one that prioritizes his family's privacy and his own vision of service to others. I may not always understand his choices, but I respect his right to make them. What I cannot accept is the idea that our differences should overshadow our love. Charles looked down briefly, then back into the camera with renewed determination. To Harry, if you are watching, I want you to know that you and Meghan and the children will always have a place at our table and in our hearts. Christmas is not the same without you. Our family is not complete without you. The unprecedented personal nature of the message was shocking, but Charles had more to say. I share this not to invite public comment on our private matters, but because I know that many families watching today face similar challenges. Perhaps a parent has lost touch with a child. Perhaps siblings have grown apart. Perhaps pride has built walls where love should build bridges. The camera stayed focused on Charles as he delivered what would become the most quoted passage of any Christmas message in royal history. If my words today encourage even one family to pick up the phone, to write a letter, to extend an invitation despite past hurt, then, speaking from my heart, will have served a greater purpose than any carefully crafted diplomatic message ever could. Charles went on to address traditional Christmas themes, service to others, gratitude for blessings, hope for the future, but everything was now viewed through the lens of his extraordinary personal revelation. When he concluded with "God bless you all," and "May God save the King," the words carried a vulnerability that transformed their meaning entirely. The broadcast ended, and the television crew began quietly packing their equipment. Charles remained seated, wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his reign or taken the most important step of his life as a father. His private secretary approached cautiously, unsure how to respond to what had just transpired. Within minutes, Charles's phone began ringing with calls from family members, government officials, and advisors. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from admiration for his honesty to criticism for breaking royal protocol. News channels around the world began analyzing every word of his message, with commentators debating whether the king had strengthened or weakened the monarchy with his unprecedented candor. But Charles wasn't thinking about public reaction or constitutional implications. He was thinking about Harry, wondering if his son was watching, hoping that his words might somehow bridge the vast distance that had grown between them. The die was cast, the words were spoken, and now all he could do was wait to see if love truly was stronger than pride, if a father's public vulnerability could succeed where private dignity had failed. The king had spoken his truth, and the world would never see the British royal family in quite the same way again. The The question now was whether Harry would respond to his father's unprecedented public plea, or whether the gulf between them had grown too wide for even such courage to bridge. The reaction to King Charles III's Christmas broadcast was immediate and unprecedented. Within minutes of the live transmission ending, social media platforms erupted with responses from around the globe. The king's personal plea to his son Harry had broken through the usual protocol and formality of royal communications, creating a moment of raw human emotion that resonated far beyond the Commonwealth realms. In living rooms across Britain, families found themselves having unexpected conversations about their own relationships. Many viewers had tears in their eyes as they listened to their king speak not as a monarch, but as a father missing his son. The switchboard at Buckingham Palace was overwhelmed with calls from members of the public expressing support, sharing their own family stories, and praising Charles for his courage in speaking so openly. Television news channels across the world immediately broke into their regular programming to analyze the broadcast. Royal correspondents who had covered the family for decades admitted they had never witnessed anything like it. The traditional Christmas message had always been carefully scripted, diplomatic, and focused on broad themes of service and unity. This message had torn up that playbook entirely. At Sandringham, Charles found himself surrounded by advisors and family members with mixed reactions to his unprecedented disclosure. His private secretary, who had served the royal family for over 2 decades, was visibly shaken by the departure from protocol. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the constitutional implications of such personal revelations will require careful management." But Princess, and ever the pragmatist, had a different perspective. "Charles," she said bluntly, "you've just done what our family should have done years ago. You've acknowledged that we're human beings, not museum pieces." Mother would have understood, even if she might have chosen a different approach. Prince William appeared conflicted, torn between his role as heir to the throne and his position as Harry's brother. "I hope this works, Papa," he said quietly. "I hope Harry hears what you're trying to say. We've all missed him more than we've been able to admit publicly." Catherine, ever the diplomat, focused on the practical implications. "The children will see the news coverage. We need to be prepared to explain why grandfather spoke about Uncle Harry on television. But I think they'll understand. Children always know when adults are hurting, even when we try to hide it." Meanwhile, in Montecito, California, Prince Harry was indeed watching his father's Christmas broadcast. The time difference meant it was morning in California, and Harry had gathered with Meghan and their children to watch what they assumed would be the typical royal Christmas message. None of them were prepared for what they heard. Meghan watched her husband's face as his father's words filled their living room. Years of tension and hurt seemed to battle with hope and love in Harry's expression. When Charles directly addressed him by name, acknowledging his absence and expressing his love, Harry's composure cracked. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hear his father's voice speaking to him with unconditional love rather than disappointment or duty. Archie and Lilibet, too young to fully understand the complexity of royal dynamics, simply heard their grandfather talking about missing them. "Why is he sad, Daddy?" 4-year-old Archie asked, sensing the emotion in his grandfather's voice even across the television screen. Harry struggled to answer his son's innocent question. How do you explain years of family tension, media pressure, and institutional constraints to a child? How do you describe the pain of feeling caught between love for your family and the need to protect your own children from the same pressures you experienced growing up? Meghan placed a gentle hand on Harry's shoulder. She had watched him struggle with the decision to step away from royal duties, had seen his pain at the resulting family rift. While she had her own complicated relationship with the royal family, she could see that this moment represented something different, a genuine attempt at reconciliation from his father. "Maybe," she said softly, "it's time to call him." But Harry wasn't ready for that step. Years of hurt and misunderstanding couldn't be healed by one television appearance, no matter how heartfelt. Instead, he chose to release a statement through his representatives, carefully worded but carrying its own emotional weight. The Duke of Sussex was moved by His Majesty's words and appreciates the public expression of love for his family. Prince Harry remains committed to his own family's well-being and privacy, while also holding space for reconciliation and healing. The door to dialogue has always been open, and these words provide hope for the future. The statement was diplomatic, but significant. It acknowledged Charles's gesture without committing to immediate action, but it also didn't close the door to future communication. Royal watchers analyzed every word, looking for signs of whether this might lead to actual reconciliation or remain symbolic. International media coverage of the Christmas broadcast was extensive and largely positive. American television networks, always fascinated by British royalty, devoted hours to analyzing the implications of Charles's unprecedented openness. Many commentators praised the king for modernizing royal communication and showing that the monarchy could adapt to contemporary expectations of emotional honesty. However, not all reactions were positive. Some traditionalist commentators and royal experts criticized Charles for what they saw as an inappropriate breach of royal dignity. They argued that the monarchy's strength lay in its ability to remain above personal drama, and that the king's public emotional display weakened the institution. The Archbishop of Canterbury, spiritual head of the Church of England, released a statement supporting the king's message. His Majesty has shown the courage to speak about reconciliation and forgiveness, values that lie at the heart of our Christian faith. Every family faces challenges, and there is strength in acknowledging our shared humanity. Political leaders across the Commonwealth also responded to the broadcast. The Prime Minister issued a statement expressing support for the king's honest reflection on the importance of family unity. Opposition leaders, typically quick to criticize royal excess, found themselves in the unusual position of praising royal vulnerability. But perhaps the most significant reactions came from ordinary families dealing with their own separations and estrangements. Social media filled with stories of people inspired by the king's words to reach out to estranged relatives. If the king can swallow his pride and speak publicly about missing his son, maybe I can call my daughter, wrote one grandmother on Facebook. Family therapists and counselors reported an immediate increase in inquiries from people seeking help to reconcile with estranged family members. The king's message had inadvertently created a cultural moment where discussing family difficulties became not just acceptable, but admirable. Within the royal household itself, staff members who had worked with both Charles and Harry expressed hope that the broadcast might lead to healing. Many of these longtime employees had watched Harry grow up and had been saddened by his departure from royal life. They remembered the close relationship between father and son and hoped it might be restored. The Queen Consort, Camilla, had watched the broadcast with a mixture of pride and concern for her husband. She had seen his private anguish over the rift with Harry and supported his decision to speak publicly, even while worrying about the potential consequences. Charles has always been guided by his heart, she told close friends. Sometimes that's exactly